That's good. It does that automatically now.
Mm-hmm. Oops. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we have a number of people joining us tonight, more than I expected, which is exciting.
Are you sure Tewksbury is not involved in?
They may well be, and that's fantastic. We're always glad to have our neighbors from Tewksbury here with us at the Chelmsford Library, welcoming the traveling librarian, Jeff Clates. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to have other folks join us. So please be patient. Everything's working fine. We're here. We can see you, but can't hear you. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, feel free to just type those into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Fantastic. That's me coming all the way from Phoenix.
Phoenix,
Thank you,
Arizona.
Library, for helping to cross-promote the program. We always love to see as many people coming to these as possible. We're looking forward to enjoying a fantastic trip to Thailand tonight. This really sounds amazing since we're going to get back down into the single digits tonight or tomorrow night. That sounds terrible. I understand we're going to be going to the mountains rather than the beaches of Thailand, but that sounds particularly interesting and less stereotypical. So.
The part of Thailand fewer people have well, for the most part, fewer people have been there.
Oh, New Jersey as well. That's
New Jersey.
Yeah, but not the subject of like the Leonardo DiCaprio film The Beach. Very different part of Thailand.
No. I actually have been to that part of Thailand as well, and it is very beautiful, but that's not what we're going to see tonight.
Excellent.
Clinton.
All right, well, we'll give it a few more minutes still, but I'll quickly mention a few other Chelmsford Public Library programs that are coming up that we're particularly excited about. Tomorrow night, we're going to have a presentation from the Museum of Bad Art. They visited with us a couple of times already. They're based out of Somerville. They have a fantastic collection, and they make some very interesting presentations out of what they have. Tomorrow night's show is called Doppelgangers, and is about amateur art that either looks like famous pieces of art or looks like it's about famous people. And the curators from the museum will talk about why people make this art, what we can learn about it, what it tells us about celebrity culture and art imitation. This weekend on Sunday at 2 p.m., we've got a workshop on herb gardening with the Blackstone Valley Veggie Gardeners. They're going to be talking to us just about how to grow your own herbs. Now's a good time to get started on that. Before the weather really gets warm, you can start things inside. So learn some tips from them, ask questions about gardening. They're fantastic presenters as well. And then our really big news is that next week on March 10th at 7 p.m., we're going to be having an in-person program at the Chelmsford Center for the Arts. Celtic musician Jeff Snow, who is a guitarist and plays traditional Irish instruments, will give a sort of early St. Patrick's Day presentation and play some traditional Irish standards and some of his own creations as well. It should be a really good time. You do need to register for that. Masks and vaccinations are required at the Center for the Arts, but you can just go to our website for all of this, chelmsfordlibrary.org. Click on events and you can see our entire events calendar there. All right, without further ado, I am going to mute myself, turn off my camera, and turn things over to Jeff Clates. As you all know, he is the recently retired head of reference services at the Lucius Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, Massachusetts. He's an avid traveler, amazing photographer. We love hearing stories about his travels. So that said, I will put myself on mute. Everybody enjoy the performance. Type those questions into the chat, and we'll be here afterwards to answer questions.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining me today. Glad to see a number of names I'm starting to recognize. As Jeff mentioned, please do feel free, since we do have a large group tonight, we're doing a webinar format, so any questions you have along the way, please put them in the chat, and I'll try to catch up with as many of those as I can see as we go through the program, but I will stay as long as necessary at the end to answer any other ones that I might have missed. I will also apologize because I have been up since 3 o'clock this morning, and I don't expect any sympathy for you, because the reason for that is that I was catching a very early flight flight from a week in Miami on the beach. So if I start to sort of trail off or fall asleep during the program, do feel free to nudge me or, do something on Zoom to let me know that I'm not actually making any sense. I am hoping to stay awake through the program. And like I said, I certainly don't expect any sympathy, having been sitting in the sun for a week, and I even missed the famous snowstorm from last weekend. But it does mean that I woke up in Miami, I'm going to bed in Massachusetts, and in the middle, we're going to Thailand. So it's a busy day. Anyway, let's get started. Oh, I should share my screen so you can see it. And I hope that looks good. And here we go. So as Jeff mentioned, we are going to start in a different part of Thailand than many of you may have been expecting or may be familiar with. Lots of people, when they travel to Thailand, of course, go straight to Bangkok and often the southern beaches. And although the north, where we're going this evening, is still quite a touristed area, it's a little bit less so. Thailand, I have to point out, is a huge country if you're not familiar with it or have never traveled in that area. The length of the country, where's my pointer, from top to bottom is pretty much about the same distance of the entire east coast of the United States, from Maine all the way to Florida. It's quite a large country geographically, and has about maybe 65, 70 million people at this point. It has an interesting history, and a long one, of course. It's the only country in this entire part of the world that was never colonized by another power, which has made their history a little bit different. And in fact, they served as a major buffer zone between a lot of the competing colonial interests in this area. The king who died, oh, I forget what year, but it was within the last 3 or 4 years, I believe, was for a long time the world's longest reigning monarch since 1946. He has since been surpassed by Queen Elizabeth, who is still going strong. And his son is now king, although the son is nowhere near as popular and as revered as his father was. As you can imagine, it is an overwhelmingly Buddhist country. In fact, 95% or more of the population is practicing Buddhists. There's a small number of Muslims who live in the very far south, which borders Malaysia. So this area down here has occasionally seen some strife because of the conflicts in religion down there. It's got a pretty strong economy for Southeast Asia, although economies all over the world have really taken a beating recently. And for a country like Thailand that depends so much on tourism, it has had some serious problems. They are only just beginning to start, after COVID, starting to admit international tourists back into the country. And it still does depend very much on agriculture, as you'll see as we go through. The red line that you can see here is the route that we took when we were there. Just to kind of remind you of where we are, this is Burma or Myanmar on this corner, and Laos curves around this side. So we're in this lump kind of way up in the mountain, this north. The north tends to be much cooler and much more mountainous than the south. The big city there where we'll start is Chiang Mai, which has about only 150,000 people in the city itself, but the metro area around it is 1 million people, pretty large, and is the second largest city in Thailand, although it still is way smaller than Bangkok, the capital and largest city, which has something around 7 million or even more at this point. And I do want to point out, we're also going to swing through Chiang Rai, which is the other major city up here. And we're going to do something called what's called the Maihong Song Loop, which is, there's Maihong Song is a mountain town here, and it's a very popular tourist loop to drive through the mountains over a 2 or 3 day period and come back to Chiang Mai because there's some very beautiful things to see along that itinerary. When we were there, and one of the reasons we went is that we have friends who are Thai, and they're both in their 80s now. But my partner David taught English there many years ago after college, and the host family he stayed with is a very nice family that we still keep in touch with pretty regularly. It's obviously being on the other, literally on the other side of the world, like 12 time zones. It's hard for either of us or them to travel, particularly as they get older. So we don't see them as much as we used to. They live in Bangkok or in an area just a suburb of Bangkok, but they have a beautiful second home up in the north, because during the worst time periods of the year, which in Bangkok is usually starting around February, March, it gets really unbearable. It's the rainy season, and it's also extremely hot and humid. So many people, if they can, head north to escape the worst of the weather and get somewhere a little bit cooler. So they have this very pleasant house on the outskirts of Chiang Mai. Sharia, the woman is, they both speak pretty good English. She was an English teacher. She's a fantastic gardener, so she has all kinds of beautiful plants tending that she tends in her garden. This is the view out over their neighborhood. It's a very relaxed neighborhood, but it's barely 10 minutes from downtown Chiang Mai. Here we are eating breakfast. This is Churia's husband Pramod, and their sort of adopted son Pat, who is a lot of fun. This is just sitting on their terrace eating breakfast. And here I am demonstrating the amazing flora that's completely different from anything I have in my garden here at home. But Chiang Mai is a favorite place for travel in this part of the country because it's a very manageable city. It's a very historic city. It has gorgeous temples and markets, but it's also very walkable. It's an old city that's completely enclosed by a moat, because it used to be a former capital of what was called the Lan Na Kingdom, way back in the very end of the 13th century up through the 1700s. The name Chiang Mai means new city, since it placed Chiang Rai further north, although it's still, of course, quite old. There are literally scores of wats, or temple complexes, in and around the city, most of which date back to around the 13th or 14th centuries, although they often have been kept up throughout the centuries. I might mention which ones are which, but certainly don't make any attempt to try to distinguish one from the other, because after a while you'll start to just get dizzy from all the wats that look the same. However, if you want at any point, do ask me or email me after if there's anything in particular you want to know more about, because some of them are quite distinctive and unique in the history that goes along with them. This one is called Wat Chang Man, and it's the oldest temple in the city from 1297. And each of these Wat complexes has a number of buildings, because they're almost, I would think of them in some ways as very similar to a Western monastery. So in addition to having a temple which is the primary location for religious worship, it's a complex of buildings. And there would also be a library like this, a smaller building where very important documents and scrolls were kept. There would be a place where the monks would eat. There's a dormitory where the monks would sleep, and various other liturgical buildings that have to do with the life of living as a Buddhist monk. So it isn't simply like just one church. It's much more like going to the Buddhist equivalent of a Western Christian monastery that has a complex devoted to different uses. But I do want you to notice some of the architectural details, which are really just incredible. It's a little hard if you don't understand a lot of the iconography that you see in these temples. After a while, they all kind of look the same. And yet over time, as you see different ones, you realize that the roofs are a little bit different and the sculptures are a little bit different and the colors are different. And in much the same way that Christian churches here even in New England, a congregational church probably looks different from a Presbyterian church or a Catholic church, or there are similarities and differences. And over time, as you are exposed to more of them, you get to see a little more. I should point out, and this is a very typical thing to see in some Buddhist temples, the monk who you see sitting here is not real. He is a wax figure, and he is a very revered individual in the history of this particular monastery. And there are many of the ones in Chiang Mai. You will see these essentially wax figures that are used to celebrate and revere famous historical figures. As Westerners, you are more than welcome to enter Buddhist temples. You're almost always all over, not simply in temples, but in almost every building in Thailand. It makes sense to travel with slip-on shoes because you'll be taking them on and off multiple times per day. And it's important to be dressed respectfully and so forth, but there are really no restrictions on entering any of these temples. Much of the decoration that you're seeing here may be dating back as far as, say, the 15th or 16th century. Some of them have been fixed up since then. And yes, much of what you are seeing is gold, not all of it. Some of it is gold paint, but particularly on the interior, you will see a lot of gold. And I'm sure in one of these pictures I can show you, not this one. At some point, I'll point out a very typical way of for Buddhists to express reverence or respect is to take little gold pieces of gold leaf and attach it to a Buddha figure, and we'll see some of that as we go along. This particular temple had a number of Buddhas, and you can see each one is in a different position, and there are different each different position, the hand positions, whether they're seated or standing, have particularly the hand position represent different concepts and are also associated with different days of the week on which you were born. This temple had a variety of them laid out so that you could see the different, those are called mudras. Here's a painted ceiling. And because this is such an old city, there are influences, architectural influences from different time periods and different styles, just as you would see in a Western city. So if you go to, well, even Boston or any European city, you'll see buildings from the Baroque period and the Gothic period and so forth. And in Thailand, it might, as I said, you might not recognize the subtle differences quite so much. But after a while, you will notice some things that are where one temple is noticeably different in style from another. Here is another good example. This is Wat Phra Singh that has a number of wax figures, life-sized wax figures. These are encased in glass of the various revered monks throughout the history of the monastery. This one is from the 14th century, and you can see it's a very different style, and it looks much older, Wat Chedi Luang, which is called the Temple of the Great Stupa, completely surrounded by these fantastic elephant sculptures. And a reclining Buddha, giant reclining Buddha, as well as a copy of the Emerald Buddha, not made of emerald, but actually jade. The original is now in Bangkok. There's a long story about the historical importance of the Emerald Buddha, having traveled around parts of Southeast Asia for literally centuries. At this point, the original is now in Bangkok, and there are a couple of places where copies have been made in important locations. Here are Naga Serpents, another very distinctive style. Depending on how interested you are in all of this, if you travel there, you may find that rather than seeing every temple in the city, you may just want to pick 2 or 3, because after a while, they do all blend together. But the atmosphere is certainly quite inspiring. And just the detail and watching the daily life of Chiang Mai as ordinary Buddhists and monks come to worship here. Here is a good example of what I was mentioning before. This particular Buddha at the entrance to this temple, you can see it looks like she's covered with aluminum foil. She looks female, but she's a Buddha. All of this sort of feathery little pieces of aluminum foil stuck on the figure is actually layer upon layer upon layer of tiny pieces of gold foil, gold leaf. Here's a very different kind of temple made entirely of wood in a very different style. And this, one of the things that you may be able to attend if the timing is right, is you may be able to see the monks going out to, they use these bowls to go out and accept alms from the population. One of the ways that Buddhists pay respect is by providing alms to feed monks. Being a monk in Buddhist Thailand is very different from the traditional Western historical idea of being a monk, where you basically sequester yourself for the rest of your life. In many Buddhist cultures, particularly in Thailand, it is not at all uncommon for a young man to go into to become a monk, a novice, and may only do that for a few years, and then at some point will leave that lifestyle and go on to marry, have children, and lead a completely secular life. Others spend their whole life, but it is a very common practice, and you will see, unlike in, say, European monasteries today, you won't see a lot of teenagers deciding it's a good thing to do. In Thailand, it is not at all uncommon as a way of seeking enlightenment, and also to some degree seeking yourself. But Chiang Mai, I think, as a city, as a historic city, and as a beautiful city, I think it actually outshines Bangkok, because Bangkok, of course, being so vastly much bigger, 10 times as many people in the metro area. Huge skyscrapers, lots of traffic. It's a big, sprawling metropolis, and it has some absolutely fantastic things to see in it, including many major monuments of Thai history, including some incredible temples. But it can be overwhelming. And I think Chiang Mai is particularly nice because it is so much more manageable. You can see in a couple of days, you can see almost all of the major sites that there are in the within the original historical moated city. This one is actually just slightly outside. This is called Wat Suan Dok and is also from the late 14th century, just in the outskirts of the city. And it was actually not only a temple complex, but a royal cemetery. So for centuries, Chiang Mai royalty have been buried in this location. And all of the tombs are completely white, which is very different from what we were just seeing in the city because they serve a different purpose. And of course, there are temples within with these enormous Buddhas. This one, I want to say, was probably a good 30 feet high. And another place that is very popular to go just outside of Chiang Mai, I should point out that the city itself is on a very flat plain, but at the base of a range of mountains. And one of the most important temples in the area, Wat Pratat Doi Suthep, is on the mountain that looks out over the city from about the same time period. Again, we're talking 14th century or so. And in the early 20th century, they finally built a paved road. So now it is much more accessible than it used to be. And it's a very popular place to go up, not only to see the temple, but also to see the amazing views out over the valley and the area around Chiang Mai. There is a legend with this place, associated with this place, that involves a white elephant. Elephants, of course, are very important in Southeast Asian culture. With a relic of the Buddha climbing the mountain, the elephant dropped dead at the top on this location, and that's where the temple was built. Whether that's true or not is the story. That's what the story is. And it is considered one of the more important sacred sites for the Thai people in their country. And of course, a big tourist draw. Here we are with Pramod and Sharia in the center of the temple complex, where there is this stupa that you can circle around, covered with gold. It's full of both tourists and also Thai people who, if they live in the country, they would certainly consider this one of the most important places in the country that they might visit at some point if they tour around their country. Lighting oil lamps is another way of paying respect. Making merit is another way of describing it. But the gold stupa in the center is really the most stunning part of it. Here's another reminder of how Buddhism has two sides to it. So this is a young Buddhist monk, but that does not mean that he is not allowed to use modern technology. You will see them on their cell phones. He has a really nice camera. While we were up there, there's the surrounding area, the mountain also has some beautiful wilderness that you don't have to go very far into to explore. These, we weren't entirely sure whether these were or were not. I think they're jackfruits. You may have heard of durian. Durian is you really can't get it around here unless you go to Asian markets in the city. Durian is famous for being a fruit that tastes very good and smells like something died. So it has that kind of reputation. And jackfruits are a slightly less intense version of the same thing, but they're big sort of melon-sized fruits that have lots of spikes all over them. And they have a custardy interior that, if you hold your nose, tastes pretty good. But other than that, it's the smell is pretty bad. Someone's asking if the heat and rainfall would affect the gold leaf. In theory, not. Gold is one of the reasons gold has been so valuable over all the years is that gold does not corrode, it doesn't rust, and there are certainly problems of pollution and humidity in Thailand that would affect all kinds of other things, but gold is actually probably one of the least. It does abrade because gold leaf is so thin that over time something that's exposed to the elements might need to be regilded, just because it gets abraded after time, just like the gold dome of the Boston State House. They had to redo, I don't know, 20 years ago. But most of what you're seeing here is, much of it is indoors, so, or at least covered. And again, the view out over the surrounding area is quite stunning. And again, this is one of the reasons why people travel to this part of Thailand, because the mountain scenery is beautiful. Much of it is very undeveloped. And it's great for adventure travel and nature travel. This particular area, again, not very far from Chiang Mai, is called Doi Intanon National Park, and it includes the highest mountain in Thailand, 8,400 feet high, and also has two fairly recent 1980s, recent in that it's in our lifetimes as opposed to centuries ago. Chetties are a particular kind of pagoda-like temple celebrating the 60th birthdays of the king and queen at the time. And we'll see those in a sec. Here we all are again. And if you drive up to the top of this mountain area, there's a beautiful vista that looks out over the national park. And you can see these two monuments in a very modern style, very different from, they were actually doing work on one of them, but very, very different from what we've been looking at down in the historic medieval city, but still incredibly dramatic, surrounded by beautiful gardens. The former king and queen were very big into agriculture, the development of agriculture, and gardening. We're going to see a little more of that when we travel further into the mountains. So there are a number of places around the country where they established gorgeous public gardens or agricultural laboratories, essentially, to learn about how to make agriculture more successful in Thailand. And being so high up, again, we're over 8,000 feet. The views through the mountains are quite something. And just south of Chiang Mai, back down on the plain, but not too far from here, is another park built in 2006, so not even 20 years ago. Another big production that was to commemorate the king's birthday and his accession to power. So this is almost like it's like a big expo park, I guess you could call it, an exposition park and gardens. And there's obviously a temple in the middle. But it covers, I don't know how many acres. It almost has the feel of like a World Expo with pavilions from different countries and so forth. Here we are inside the temple. And again, what you're looking at is very different from what you've seen before, because this is very modern. This is, within the last 20 years, the main temple. But throughout this entire park, and it is huge, you could easily spend half a day wandering around it. There are pavilions that represent different kinds of plants and different kinds and different countries, almost along the lines of Epcot down at Disney World in Florida. So as a way of promoting responsible agriculture and gardening, each one of these pavilions showcases the culture and style and plants of a particular area. So that actually makes it quite beautiful to walk around, because you can see the preponderance of countries is from Asia. This one, I believe, was Bhutan. There's a pavilion from China. There's one from Japan. There's one from Laos. There's an incredible orchidarium. As you can imagine, orchids and other tropical plants grow beautifully in Thailand. And they had a whole hothouse full of every imaginable kind of orchid and flower. And another one, this is just, the whole area is surrounded by temples. I promise you very soon you'll see more nature and fewer temples. But this one is called Wat Pratat Doi Kam, meaning the Golden Temple, and it's on a hill just south of the city. And it also is a little bit different and known for its extremely large Buddha. One thing that I think to Western eyes is a little jarring is to see sculptures. We're so used to seeing ancient Western sculptures that tend to be white and stone. And in Thailand, very often sculptures are extremely vivid. These aren't old, of course, these are relatively recent sculptures, but they are painted to look as vividly realistic as possible. So to our eyes, it's a very different look. And in fact, when we were traveling with Sharia and Promote, the couple that we had been staying with, our friends, from where they come from, it's a very different attitude, because we often want to go see ancient ruins. That's a very common thing for us to do, and it's mentioned in the guidebook that there's the ruins of some temple from centuries ago, and they were completely mystified that anyone would want to go to see broken down ruins that are in poor condition. Why would you, when you can go see these beautiful new things? It's just a different kind of a different cultural attitude. So that this is a close-up of that Buddha, which is about 50 feet tall and can be seen from quite a distance. Paper lanterns. And again, here's another good example of that, making merit by doing various different kinds of small actions, one of which is to leave coins or to attach little pieces of gold leaf to these metal balls. It's kind of, I guess, kind of akin to going into a Christian church where you might pay to buy a candle, a couple of dollars to just buy a candle and light it in someone's memory. This is a way of one of the many ways in which Thai people will make merit. And here's actually a more vivid example of a Buddha that has not had that much done to it yet. So you can actually see these. This is not an old Buddha that has been poorly taken care of. This is just one that has yet to be completely covered with these small squares of gold leaf. Obviously, traveling anywhere in Thailand, food is an enormous part of that. And some of the best food is just at roadside restaurants, literal roadside restaurants where there's traffic sailing by, and trying all kinds of different kinds of soups and noodles and spicy and not spicy. And there's inevitably 15 different things that come out. A popular way for tourists to get around too is this little three-wheeled contraption called a tuk-tuk, which is named after the noise that it makes because it's really kind of a rattle-trap way of getting around the city. But it's cheap, and it's worth it to do it at least once, if just that you can have the harrowing experience of careening through traffic on something like this. And traffic is, even in Chiang Mai in the north, is quite bad. At least in the area immediately around the city, you will find lots of tuk-tuks, lots of motorcycles, and all manner of vehicles crammed with different kinds of people, hanging on the back, and polluting terribly. There's no question that, particularly in the area around the cities, there's a lot of agricultural burning. There's fumes from auto exhaust and so forth. So particularly depending on the time of year, when throughout the year the climate changes, of course, and at certain times you can have air masses that really keep the pollution close to the ground, and that can be quite unpleasant. Again, just outside of Chiang Mai, I wanted to show you a couple of different kinds of temples. This is Wat Chet Yot, built in the 15th century, so still quite old, but this is one that is completely different from what we've seen so far, and that's because it was built in the Indian or Burmese style. It's a style that was much more influenced by the countries to the west of Thailand. Just some street scenes. Here are two young women making merit by bowing before the monk and making offerings to him of food. As you leave the city, this is a typical street on the way out of into the countryside. We took a couple of multi-day trips away from their house in Chiang Mai, just so that we could get out into the countryside. And although it's a big area, if you're driving and have your own vehicle, which you really do, you need to unless you're going to take a tour, there's nothing is more than you could easily see a lot within, say, a 2 or 3 day loop, using Chiang Mai as a base. This was a place that we stopped just by the side of the road to get lunch. I loved these umbrellas. So taking a quick look back at our map again, what we're going to do is we've been in Chiang Mai and going into the mountains to see some of the temples up in the hills, right around this area here. But we're going to do this loop through the mountains that more or less follows the border with Myanmar. Right. And this is another one of Thailand's many national parks, Hoi Nam Dang, a beautiful forested area in the mountains. And it's very famously known for its sea of fog, which we did not see because the condition, you have to be there early in the morning, and it has to be the right kind of conditions. So this is a view of what the sea of fog looks like. This is not my photo, but sometimes very early in the morning, when the atmospheric conditions are right, you can be way up high with the mountains poking through, and the entire valley area around it on winter mornings can be filled with fog that dissipates as the morning goes on. So we didn't actually see that. But nonetheless, it's a beautiful area. The whole region is very popular for adventure travel. So there's hiking, rafting tours, elephant tracks, all kinds of things like that if you're into that sort of thing. This is just a typical house along the side of the road. And some of the scenery. We stayed in a nice, delightful spot in a town called Sapong, which is one of the real centers for adventure travel because it's on a river that's very popular for rafting and caving also. There's a lot of caves in this area. So for very little money, all of us stayed in this wonderful series of cottages that were literally built out over the river. And they had a restaurant right on site, and you could just sit there and relax on the terraces that looked out over the river. These are not ancient artifacts. I took this picture only to show you what in this part of Thailand they use as garbage cans. They're by the side of the road, and instead of the blue bins or whatever color you use in your town that you put out your recycling and your garbage in every week, this is what they use instead. And they look like big cooking pots, but you'll see them by the side of the road. And here is the main road through this area. I should point out a lot of these spirit houses, which you will see everywhere. Everyone has a spirit house. And it's a way of expressing religious sentiment, putting out offerings to the spirits and so forth. But it's kind of funny because you'll also go by their equivalent of a garden center. And the Thais are big gardeners, so there are plenty of garden centers where you can buy all kinds of stuff, interesting plants, flowers, orchids, all that, but you can also buy all kinds of things like this to stick in your yard. So you'll be driving down a road like this and go by the equivalent of a garden center that you'd see on Route 114, and they have scores and scores of different spirit houses in different colors that you can pick out for your house. One of the places that you can stop along here on this road is called Tomluk, which is a very large cave system that has a river, underground river running through it about a mile long. And it's an interesting place to stop. The whole area in this part of the mountains is karst limestone. In fact, much of Southeast Asia, I'm sure you've seen photos from many different cultures, like in southern Thailand and Halong Bay in Vietnam, and the mountains of China, where there are just these incredible landscapes that are the result of eroded limestone over millennia of erosion, and that ends up creating dramatic rock formations, but also huge numbers of caves, and sometimes very large cave systems. This particular one you can take boat rides into. And it's a pretty dramatic cave, considering that you're boating your way into it. But it's also important historically. What we're looking at here are wooden coffins that were found in the cave, that they have dated to about 2,000 years ago or so. This is, in fact, the boat we rode on. And you'll also see a variety of mountain tribal people. There's a number of different ethnic tribes as you get up further north into the Golden Triangle area, where all those different countries come together, Laos and Myanmar and China as well. And so there's a number of what were once very isolated tribes, all living with their different cultures in this area. And now you'll see a lot more of that mixing as a number of them are now living in the cities and traveling around. And you'll see a lot of different costumes that if you know what you're doing, you can probably identify which tribe they're connected to by the kind of hats they wear, the kind of clothes, and so forth. In fact, on this trip, I got big into hats, which is kind of funny because I'm not really a hat person, but I saw so many amazing hats. I wanted to buy a hat everywhere I went. And I think I came home with at least 3 or 4 different Thai hats that I assumed I would wear somewhere. And then of course you don't. I didn't buy one of these. I thought this would be a bit much. But again, just some more scenes of the landscape around here. And another place a little further down, again in the cave area, this region of the mountains, this is called Tomluk. And it's a sacred cave because of the fish that are in it. It's a water-filled cave that has hundreds and hundreds of brook carp, which is just a local kind of fish. And the fish have since time immemorial been revered by the locals. And there is a nearby Hindu statue, actually, that is said to protect these fish. And so you can wander around and actually see the fish. And you can make merit by paying to buy little bits of food to feed the fish with, if you want. But they live in enormous quantities in this cave system that is partly out in the open and then partly in this underground river system. The big stop along this loop that we're making through the mountains, and the town that it's named for is called Maihong, which is just a fantastic place to visit. And it's interestingly, it wasn't until the late 1960s. It's an old town from like the 17th century. But it wasn't until the 1960s that it actually got a paved road. So for a long time, it was quite isolated. And it is very well known today because it has a wealth of Burmese style temples from the 19th century. That's not terribly surprising because it's extremely close to the border, the national border with Burma, which is now known as Myanmar. And so you can see a completely different style of temple here, and there are many, many, many of them. It also just happens to be set in a very beautiful location, in a sort of valley completely surrounded by mountains, and also with a beautiful lake. So both during the day and at night, it's just a stunning location amid the mountains and completely surrounded by all of these temples. It's a good place to stop as well. We stayed here overnight. And you can do trekking through the mountains. This tour in particular mentions that it'll actually sounds like it'll be quite unpleasant. You won't sleep and you'll hear bad jokes from your tour guide. The town also has a really nice market. I love, even if I'm not actually interested in buying anything, I love going to foreign markets just to see what kinds of things are available. Most of what you're seeing here is not really, there's a few areas that are aimed at tourists, but most of this market is really aimed at locals. So there's innumerable kinds of fruits and vegetables and food, but also all kinds of local things that here we'd go to Target or Walmart. There they go to a place like this. And it's almost like an outdoor museum where you can just see all different kinds of things that are part of the daily life of the people in this part of the country. This was one of my favorite temples in this particular town, again, because of its Burmese style. This is one of the 19th century ones from the 1860s, and it's called Wat Hua Wian. And the style is called Shan. And what looks white in these particular images is actually metal. This might give you a better close-up of it. So it's not actually white painted. This is like almost like pressed tin. So it's silvered and glitters in the sun, and is used right against the wooden, very dark wooden temple. So it almost even recalls some of the old stave churches that you might see in Norway, but but in a completely different direction. And here's a similar styled one, but instead of silver, they used gold painted metal, and a bell tower. But the streets are really fun to walk around, and particularly at night as the sun goes down. These are little prayers. This is common in the Orthodox Church, actually, Christian Orthodox Church. But it's a similar idea where you're attaching a little thing that represents a prayer of some kind. And like any town around here, there's a hill. And if you go up to the top of the hill, there will be an important temple. And this one is called Wat Pratat Doi Intanon. And it has a beautiful view, again, out over the valley, back down to the town itself with all of its temples. And as you can imagine, it's a popular place to go at sundown so that you can watch the sun drop into the west over the mountains in Burma, actually. Looking out through the temple. Of course, you won't be alone. There'll be plenty of other people up there with you, but it's still well worth the trek up the mountain. And then when you come down, you can have a terrific meal and wander around the town at night, which is just as beautiful as in the daytime, because everything gets lit up and there's a night market. And while we were there, they happened to be letting off the paper lanterns to go up into the sky. So again, this is all surrounding a lake. So walking around the lake and seeing all of these temples lit up, and then one by one, these lanterns, paper lanterns, were going up into the sky. It was just magnificent. Here are some of the people letting them off. And in the morning, very peaceful, mist rising off the lake, completely different atmosphere. And we strolled around in the quiet of the morning where hardly anybody was out. And we continued along this. Again, we're doing this loop through the mountains along the border to another spot way up in the mountains, right at the edge of the border. Oh, I think I only took this photograph just because I had never seen this kind of, I'm not actually sure what this means. I'll let you think for yourself what that actually denotes. But we stopped in a place along here at a Japanese war museum in a town called Kunyiwam, which is also known as the Thai-Japan Friendship Memorial Hall. And it talks about the retreat of the Japanese army in 1944. They had come through Burma, what at the time was called Burma, and were retreating through this area. And it's quite a moving story. If you don't know much about the Pacific theater of World War II, it's particularly intense to learn about what happened in this particularly local area. Many Japanese soldiers died here. This town, in fact, was one of Japan's most important bases in Thailand for their Burmese campaign. This is an example of, in the museum, of very old writing. But it was a very interesting educational experience when, unless you have someone in your family who was connected to the Pacific Theater, you may not know very much about just what was going on in this part of the world during that war. So again, this was, we've kind of gone along this route here and come back down this way. And now we're going to head up, finish the program by heading up this loop up to the north from Chiang Mai. And as you head north, there's a fantastic place to stop called Wat Ban Den, about 30 miles north, which is a fairly recent complex of temples in a style called the Lan Na style. This one here is a good example of it, that has many different layers of roof that come all the way down, almost to the ground. This is not a terribly old complex, but it has a very nice view out over the agricultural plains and some beautiful gardens and just incredible detailed buildings, many of which are guarded, like this one is by the Naga Serpents. This is an excellent example of what I mentioned earlier in the program about each one of these Buddha figures is displaying a different arrangement of hand gestures which have different symbolism. And the park has, I don't know how many temples, but it's several acres. And although there have been temples on this site for a very long time, most of the buildings that you're seeing in these photographs are actually only about maybe 30, 40 years old. A new abbot arrived, a monastic leader, and he started a very active rebuilding campaign. So now there's all these brand new buildings, and it's become quite a sight with very modern sculptures, very modern detail, and very fantastic. They're in a traditional style, but they incorporate a lot of very fantastical creatures and unbelievable carvings. There are even stupas that represent each of the 12 Chinese zodiac signs here as well. And every once in a while you encounter something where you can guess at the symbolism, but you're not quite sure. Here's another, this is another one I'll leave to your imagination. But it's such a vast complex that, again, I think you could spend 2-3 hours there at least and feel like you had barely scratched the surface. And heading further up into the mountains, it gets a little bit more rural and much more mountainous. And we stayed overnight in an area where there's a complex called this Queen Siriki, the former queen of the king who died a few years ago. There's in the foothills near Chiang Mai is this botanical garden that was opened in the early 1990s and is a huge complex of greenhouses and gardens on a very big hill. And it focuses, perhaps not surprisingly, on plants that are native to this part of Thailand. But there were unbelievable flowers and unusual plants. Here's a pitcher plant. My impression is that the Thai people certainly rival the British for being obsessive about gardening, and both tropical plants and flowers of all kinds. Here I am. And those are not real flowers, obviously, they're made of plastic. But it was a fun place to explore. Here's another exotic pitcher plant. They had weird fruit trees. To be honest, I don't actually remember where this is. It was in that same area, but I just thought it was one of the more fantastic temples I had seen with this. It almost looks like a hand, but these are Naga Serpents guarding the temple. And another market that we stopped at with all kinds of, most of these are different kinds of root vegetables. There's also an area in this, again, up in the caves called Chiang Dao, where there are Buddha caves. We may be doing, we haven't scheduled them yet, but I believe either in April or May, we're going to continue this series of programs, and I'm going to do another one on Laos, which is just across the border and was part of the same trip. And they had caves there where essentially old Buddhas are retired. They don't get destroyed. And they go almost to the equivalent of a Buddha attic, where they are still treated with respect and not destroyed, but decommissioned essentially when they get too old and fragile. This was another place where they were stored. It was also a kind of creepy one because there were enormous spiders in the cave as well. And this is another location where the caves, they discovered that these caves had been used for hundreds or even thousands of years by earlier tribes that were in the mountains and were often used as burial sites. And again, here's another location where there were fish in the temple, and making merit is something that Thai people are very conscious of. There are so many ways to do it. And one of the ways in this case is to feed the fish again. I should point out too, because I think, I hope you haven't forgotten this, that all of what you're seeing now, the temperature was quite nice. We were there in I want to say it was late December, early January, mid-January, which is a good time to travel in Thailand in general because it tends to be dry. And there's not as much rain and it is much less humid. That isn't to say that it's cold, but particularly for Westerners who aren't used to the extreme heat and humidity, it's a very good time to travel there. And so all of what you're seeing, the weather was probably in this, 70s and 80s, but for a tropical vacation, it was quite manageable to travel around. And as we head up to Chiang Mai, we drove by this not very dramatic, but it's a big deal in the area. Chiang Dao is the second highest mountain in all of Thailand. And if you remember, we went up to the tallest one in that national park that was closer to Chiang Mai. This one's a bit more noteworthy just because it stands all by itself out of the plain. So it's much more dramatic as you drive by it. And we went past it on the way to an interesting place called Doyangkam, which is literally on the Burmese border. And in fact, you can easily see across it. And it is the home of a very important royal agricultural station that called Angkang, that was established by the king as a garden and a nursery. It's a huge complex. It fills the entire valley. And the point of it, along with similar places around the country, was to promote the cultivation and investigation of crops that were more temperate. Up in the mountains, there are microclimates where they are surprisingly conducive to growing plants that you wouldn't necessarily think would grow in Thailand, like apples, cherries, peaches, cabbage. And this particular station was set up specifically to investigate the feasibility of growing these kinds of crops and diversifying the economy in Thailand. You may remember or have at least heard of the fact that we are very close to the part of Thailand way up in the north. It's called the Golden Triangle, where the three countries come together, and it is a big area for illegal drug trading, which is opium in particular, which of course is highly lucrative if you, just like in Afghanistan and other places, if a farmer can grow that and make huge piles of money, why wouldn't they? Except that it, of course, causes all kinds of residual problems. And so part of what the king was trying to do was encourage the lucrative growing of other crops that could replace those and be more beneficial to society in general. So they have tried all kinds of different fruits like raspberries, plums, kiwis, even strawberries. They grow carrots and Brussels sprouts, peas, temperate flowers that you would see in the British Isles, like carnations and roses. So to end up in this valley and on the border between two tropical nations in Southeast Asia and see things like lavender and roses and dahlias growing, it was a very interesting place. Not to mention extremely beautiful. It had, because it was in this valley, it had the feeling of kind of like a Shangri-La. These are lupins, the kind of lupins that we would grow here or in Northern Europe. And as I said, it is right on the border. So this fence that you see here is the border between the two countries. So on the other side of the fence is Myanmar, which is going through yet more upheaval every time you think that Myanmar is quieting down and opening up to international tourism and getting its act together. Something goes wrong again with the military government, and so it's in a bad state again. But what you're looking at on the opposite hill over there is a military base. And there's one on the hill that we're standing on where this photograph was taken, and they cautiously observe each other over the little valley. Here I am proving that I was right on the border of Myanmar. But there, 20, 30 years ago, there were occasional military skirmishes, but it's at this point, it's a perfectly safe place to be. And again, it's just gorgeous mountain scenery and very cool. In fact, at night, we were downright chilly. And acres of flowers and formal and informal gardens. Chiria, being an avid gardener herself, was obsessed with seeing all the different kinds of things she might buy to grow at her house. And then in the morning, the sun comes up and it's cool, and you almost feel like you could be in the foothills of the Alps or somewhere in Canada. Back down in the valley, we went sailing by that big mountain again. And we're finishing up by making a little tour through Chiang Mai. This is just to give you an idea of what driving is like in Thailand. You never know what you're going to see or how dodgy it might be. Another one of the incredible new temples to see is called Phaton. It's called the Crystal Pagoda, and it's another very recent temple. This is not old, but it was built high up on a hill that overlooks a town in a river valley, and it's become an important pilgrimage site with very nice views over the area. But it's totally modern inside. You actually go inside, there's a ramp that spirals all the way up to this domed interior that is obviously worlds apart from the medieval Wats that we saw in Chiang Mai proper from the 14th century, but very beautiful in its own way. Again, here's another example of a figure of an old, one of the revered monks, historic monks connected to the temple in the area, and completely covered with little bits of gold leaf. And weird, lifelike temple decorations on the outside. I think they even had rabbits. It's unusual because of the purple color too. Oh yeah, here are the big rabbits. Not what you would expect to see. So again, being perched high up on a hill, it has this view out over the valley you can see for probably 20 miles. And because the valley is very flat, there's a lot of agriculture. We're down out of the mountains where that agricultural experimental station was. So it's much more warm down here. This is where you'll find citrus groves and all kinds of other much more typical tropical plants. But we're also going to start to see more hill tribes. I love this little baby with the typical hat. And unusual things. This is called a nipple fruit. All kinds of weird stuff in this corner of Thailand. And I'm going to finish up with a place that is extremely popular. People know about it outside of Thailand. And it's kind of funny because it's so bizarre. This is Wat Rong Kun. It's very recent. It was started it was started earlier than that, but it opened to the public in 1997 and is still ongoing. It is right next to the highway. You can't see from this photograph, but imagine yourself driving down Route 28 or Route 114 with all kinds of other businesses and stuff and traffic. And then right by the side of the road is this absolutely incredible temple that is the dream project of a contemporary Thai artist who I could tell you his name, but you'll never have heard of him. It's Chalamerchai Kositpipat. I think that's how you pronounce it. But he has this is his personal project, and he has been working on it for decades. And there was an earlier temple on this site that was in very bad repair. And the artist has spent something over $1 million of his own money to visit this. And Thai people are able to visit the temple for free. They ask foreigners to make a donation. But there are all kinds of just bizarre imagery. But the overwhelming part of this complex, and again, it's a complex, not just a single building, is mostly white with pieces of mirrored glass. There's a part of it that's kind of kitschy. This is one of the buildings. Actually, here you can see the signs for the public restrooms, the men's room and the ladies' room on either side. So he's built these fabulous buildings. But the highlight is this incredible white and silver mirrored construction in the middle, particularly as the sun goes down. It glows. And it's also funny because there's a lot of very contemporary symbolism in it. You will see superheroes. You'll find little bits and pieces from Harry Potter, Michael Jackson. I think there was even some Hello Kitty stuff in there. It's just completely bizarre. And to get into the main temple, you walk over this like a little drawbridge. You can see it on the right. And there's this very disturbing sculpture of just hundreds and hundreds of hands reaching up. And so people drive way out of their way to see it just because it's so completely unusual. It actually suffered some damage. There was, I'm forgetting, it was either an earthquake or a storm, but it suffered some damage from a natural disaster kind of problem about 8 years ago or so. And there was thought that he might have to shut it down because it had been too damaged, but they got it back on track, and it is still completely visitable. I'm not showing you any of the pictures that show the ugly highway next to it because it kind of takes away from the magic of the site. This particular temple was almost sort of pearlescent. He even has this weird installation that's about the evils of smoke. So that's where we're going to end tonight. And I'm going to unshare my screen. I had promised to be done by 8:30, but that does give us a few minutes to take any questions. I'm just going to take a quick look through and see if anyone has any questions that I missed. Oh, I do see one. Who built the temples? That's a good question. Certainly the historic temples, it's anyone's guess. It's whoever were the artisans back in those days that knew how to do that stuff. Today, for the constructions that are much more recent, I don't honestly know. That would be a good question to find out. Obviously, they are people who have the craftsmanship and the artistic capability to do that, but it's a very different skill set from what people would have been doing in the 14th century. Someone is actually asking right now about the White Temple at the very end. And again, that was mostly designed and built by this one guy, and he is an artist. And he does paintings and other kinds of media as well. Most of his, I believe, is just concrete, constructed in certain ways. Some of the more delicate stuff is presumably made out of other kinds of durable materials, but that temple is not a good example because he is such a quirky contemporary artist that it's not really directly comparable to the more traditional temples that would be built in some of the other places. Some of the materials are wood, painted. Some of them have stone underneath. It really depends on the time period, but I don't know enough about it to say for sure. And so I guess we're going to wrap up. Thanks for joining us tonight. And if you check the Chelmsford Library, we haven't, as I said, we haven't scheduled the programs for the next couple of months, but we should be doing that shortly. And we will be going to similar parts of the world. We'll be visiting parts of Laos, which is the country to the immediate east. And we'll also visit Kuala Lumpur as well. So I hope we'll be able to you'll be able to join me for those programs later. So thank you very much.